Hello and welcome back to Read Becca. Brian from Bookish had issued kind of a challenge to the BookTube community to talk about banned books because we are seeing a pretty big groundswell around banning books in schools and libraries, and I am obviously never for that. I think there are avenues that parents can go about getting exceptions for their children from reading as part of a class if it's an assigned reading. I think that from most of what we've seen around these banned book claims, they usually are for sexual content of some kind, but there's some subtext there that for sure it's not really about the sexual content. It's about something else, often LGBTQ elements or racial conversations that are uncomfortable to these parents. And being uncomfortable is a reason why I do read, but even if that's my personal reason, there shouldn't be a cohesive, agreed upon reason for reading. I would point you to start out, just before I get into rambling too much on this, to go read an article from Neil Gaiman that he wrote on his blog many years ago, I think more than a decade ago at this point probably, called Why Defend Icky Speech? And he talks about things that are extremely offensive to us in our sensibilities in real life, and the idea that we should be able to engage with those topics in art and in an educational setting where we're discussing controversial and difficult topics. That is exactly the right place to work through those things and not censor them. So I had selected out a couple of options originally that I was planning on just kind of skimming over a few options and chatting about them. And really I had too many tangents that one book in particular gave me to talk about. So I wanted to talk about Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe. And this is a personal graphic memoir, and for me it's just ridiculous to talk about censoring someone's life experience. That's what we're talking about here. And this is just an account of growing up, not understanding your gender, not understanding why you feel differently from what you're being told, and going through the extremely difficult process of not having language to discuss that with people. Even in this one, we have very supportive parents to Maya, the author, and they as well don't have the language or the tools to talk about it with their child. And that creates some difficulty, but overall they're extremely supportive. And that's why I love this one so much, because Maya's surrounded mostly by support. This is not a trauma-filled memoir. I think why this has been banned in many cases, of course, it is that pornography idea is placed on this, but there's no porn in here. I think there is one graphic sex scene, sort of graphic sex scene, but it's not sensual or pornographic. It's awkward. It's all about how two loving partners are trying to work through understanding their sexual needs when they don't have heteronormative sexual needs, and trying to work together with each other as a committed partnership awkwardly. So I think the other that might be the graphic parts are reproductive health appointments, so medical appointments. And this is so good at capturing the fact of having difficulties around your body that I think would apply to other areas of young people who are struggling with that, not just to do with gender and sexuality, where it is difficult to go to see a doctor because of certain physical aspects that you might have. And this uses those two things to talk about advocating for yourself, really. Coming to understand yourself better so that you can be your own advocate. Because through this story, Maya works through that extremely painful, traumatic, and awkward situation. So in both cases, Maya works through having an understanding so that then you can speak for yourself and be your own advocate for your sexual needs, for your reproductive health, and have a better experience in those areas. And that's why this is so important for young people, I think. Having the language, not just in those facets, but in having pronouns. Having the language of pronouns was something that really opened things up for Maya, and having a sense of belonging and community for the first time. So I think those are all critical impacts of this book that are why it's being banned, because it's an attempt to suppress that understanding. But that's why it's so critical for young people, because they are going through these difficult times where they're trying to understand themselves, whether they are cis, hetero, or genderqueer. So I think, no, absolutely, this doesn't contain any pornographic content, really. I would say it's very simply drawn. This is not super graphic. Why is it being banned? I think I'm going to put this down here. So my larger take, the big discussion here. So I think that in many ways, the discussion surrounding book bans is about control, and a lot of those come from religion. So my tangents kind of begin with my personal experience and my upbringing, which was very fundamentalist evangelical and on quite the extreme end. I was raised within churches, and these were what you would think of as a normal community church. They were not extremist by any means. The churches enabled those kind of extreme elements, even if not participating in them themselves or directly enforcing them by any means. So I think I was raised to not go to school. I never went to school until college, and I have a pretty poor education in terms of a lot of scientific knowledge. I had to work to test into college. I don't have a high school diploma, that kind of thing. So definitely a situation of having knowledge controlled and isolated, and that is a lot of what we see with these book bans. I think something I have seen. My family is in Washington, and that was where I grew up for kind of my preteen and teen years. I have seen similarly extreme families that we were connected with get very caught up in things surrounding a sex ed teaching for, I think, preschool in that state a couple of years ago. And there was a very big push, again, on the dogma of it's pornography. And they're not teaching preschoolers pornography for sure. That's definitely not happening. The pushback was stating that, and the reality of it was that they were teaching these young kids anatomy and like what their physiology was. They were teaching them consent, and so those are things that young kids need to know. And the claim was, you need to leave this up to parents, but that is extremely naive, I think, to say that all parents are good, that kids that need to know consent are actually going to hear that from their parents. Like, that's probably the most critical thing that a child in an abusive situation is going to need to learn from someone, and that's not going to be their parent. So I saw that exact same ideology coming up there, where there was a huge groundswell for pushing back against this sex ed for preschoolers and saying it's pornographic and being horrified by it, when in reality this was incredibly healthy and important education for these kids. So I think having that knowledge and the message of this book really has a very personal connection for me. I think it's absolutely critical for young people to have personal reproductive knowledge, and we see it kind of almost joked about in movies and books. Sometimes the young girl doesn't have an awareness of how reproduction happens, right? And I just recently read The Number One Ladies Detective Agency, and it's not treated in that way, but certainly the protagonist character gets into a bad situation because she doesn't have a fundamental knowledge of her own sexuality and sex in general, even though she had a very empowering, supportive parent who was for her independence. She had not been taught all of the tools that she needed for her independence, and that included sexual health. So I think sexual health and reproductive health knowledge for all genders and all sexualities is really important from a fact-based perspective, and that's not pornographic. I'm going to share a slightly embarrassing story on that. And my knee jerk is that it's embarrassing, but practically and rationally, I'm aware it's fine. It's really not a big deal, and it's something where like I couldn't possibly have known better based on the information I had. So I was hanging out with a friend at this friend's house, and As you do when you're young, this friend had some secret knowledge that they wanted to spout off, and that was about sex. And my immediate reaction was, oh no, my parents wouldn't do that. Sex is a sin, because that was 100% of the conversation that I had had about sex. And that was it. Like, that was the only thing that was ever depicted to me was sex is sin, sex is sin, sex is sin. So, of course, then the parents became involved, and they kind of chuckled and were like, no, that's not actually how this works, and reproduction, generally, we won't really talk about this. But then, of course, they told my mom, and so then I, yet again, didn't get a talk. I got a reading of a Bible verse. So that was the extent of my sexual knowledge, was suddenly sex is sin, but also sex is okay in some contexts, but I'm not told what context it's okay in or why. And now I know that that's how babies are made, but again, I don't have any details of what sex actually is. So that's a very complicated and confusing place to be. And that's why books like this are very important, because this is what is actually happening in these kids' lives. For a teen, kids are on the internet at 11, 12, 13 for sure, but even before the internet. I was growing up before the internet and when the internet was very new. So even before that, most of us knew someone who had gotten pregnant in middle school, very young. So none of us really understood everything about how that worked. So even once I did know more, it was still a very shadowy unknown. Books like this really help take away the power of that shadowy unknown, the taboo of it, and that doesn't mean more sex. That means more awareness about sex. And the idea that purity culture has created around that is incredibly damaging and harmful. So if that is something that you have experienced going through, or if it's something you have no awareness of, if this is completely new to you, I would really recommend checking out the book Shameless by Nadia Bolz-Weber. It really dives into purity culture within the evangelical church in the US specifically, and how damaging that has been in many ways, like these sorts of book bans, and how much I think that is where a lot of this comes from. But it really helped me see and understand what's behind that. And one thing I learned from this was that the term teetotaler, commonly related to alcohol and anti-drinking, that came out of a slogan, capital T for total abstinence. So it was a purity movement around alcohol abstinence. That obviously didn't really survive. That didn't stick around, and even in churches that are quite anti-drinking, you don't hear the same language of things like, if you're thinking about a drink, that's not something they're going after as being this thoughts crime of like a major sin. What they're doing with sex is all about power and control, and it's everything down to you can't be thinking about it or you're committing a sin. So that purity movement and culture has created a lot of what we're seeing now, and mostly it is about power and control, but not just about power and control over others. It's an internal feeling of loss of control that's being reacted to, where they see a changing world and don't understand it, and are trying to buckle down and create a bubble of security for themselves while harming the people that are now having a safer world. So a changing world, instability is creating a lot of this. And for most of us, we're seeing things get better, not worse. So I think we're going through that really difficult, challenging space where people are dealing with change and not dealing well with it. If we can keep pushing and keep going through this change, I think we are going to be better for it. So I think that books like this that inform and give young people something to relate to as they're going through their, coming of age, are important. I think discussing difficult topics is important for us to do that. So hopefully that's all I have to say. I think I've talked much too long. Thank you so much to Brian for bringing this topic of banned books to us to discuss on BookTube. And thank you so much for watching.